Okay, that sounds great. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Emma. I just want to thank you for your time today. Whether you're working from home and logging on briefly, or whether you're wrestling your kids and trying to listen in the meantime. So I just want to thank you for your time. And we'll go to the next slide. I would like to introduce myself further. Again, my name is Emma Westling. I'm a pediatric occupational therapist. I do have extensive experience with the pediatric population in advanced training and certifications in order to support the pediatric feeding and neurodivergent population. Outside of work, I'm a mom of an 8-month-old son named Brooks, and my daughter is 16 years old and has 4 legs. We'll go ahead to the next slide. So I just want to touch base on the background of pediatric feeding and why we support families and children through this process. So when we think about feeding, feeding and eating is actually the only activity that our children do that requires all of their sensory systems to be active. So when we think about our sensory systems, we think about those 5 basic senses that we all know, but then there are also some hidden senses. One of them being proprioception, or a big fancy word for body awareness. So our children's ability to understand, is their body standing? Is their body sitting? How close are they to the table? How coordinated can I get a utensil to my mouth? Another sense is our vestibular sense, or a sense of balance. So am I able to maintain balance on a chair? Do I feel dizzy at all? Do I need extra movement to know where my body is? And one of the most important senses is the last hidden sense. It's called interoception. It's that internal awareness of your body and your cues. So, understanding, are you hungry, thirsty? Do you have to go to the bathroom? Are you feeling ill? Any of those internal cues, it's just the awareness of that. And then when we think about feeding as well, feeding is actually a learned behavior, which is one of the biggest misconceptions about feeding. I feel like oftentimes parents, when we do support them, they feel, oh, my child will just know how to eat. And that is true to an extent. So babies are born with a reflex. In about 2 to 4 months, that reflex starts to go away. So it's that suck, swallow, breathe reflex that supports breastfeeding or bottle feeding. And around that 2 to 4 month age range is typically when we start to see feeding turn to a volitional, or a task that we have to control. And we learn through exposure, repetition, and modeling. So it's not as easy of my child just knows how to eat intuitively. It's actually learned behavior, just like playing soccer is. And third, feeding and eating actually does not begin at the mouth. There is pretty significant clinical and experiential research out there showing that there are actually 32 steps we take when looking at a food, and then which actually takes us to chewing and swallowing. So we have to be able to look at the food, we have to be able to interact with it, smell it, touch it, taste it, chew it, and then swallow to consume it. So when we think about presenting our children with a new food, it's not as easy as see food, bring food to mouth. There are actually those 32 steps. And one of my favorite reasons why we support families in this process, and probably my client's least favorite reason, is we actually have to try a food 10 to 15 times in order to understand if we do like it or not. Children are going to want to fight back on this, but there's a lot of research to support this point. And now these 10 different times have to be 10 or 15 different times across 10 to 15 different occasions for your children and your child to understand if they like it or not. So it's not just 10 bites of broccoli in one sitting. It has to be 10 different bites of broccoli over 10 different exposures. We'll go to the next slide. And I just want to highlight a couple different questions that I typically get. We will delve into more of what is picky eating, but just a quick overview. Picky eating is considered when a child has strong food preferences regarding to color, texture, or a specific brand. These children often have a very restricted diet variety of the number of foods we'll eat, and we'll go ahead and we'll talk about the developmental norms of what we would expect. And then these children often actively avoid new foods. So this can be a meltdown, this can be running away from the table, this can be pushing it away, spitting it out, any sort of avoidance of a new food. Another question I typically get is, why does my child only eat one brand of snack foods, or why does my child only eat snack foods? And when we think about our food companies in our country, These companies go to great lengths to ensure that their product is actually uniform and consistent. So when we think about a goldfish container, there's really not much variability in the product within that container. Sure, there might be, a little bit more of a crispy goldfish, but 99% of the time, these goldfish are going to taste the same. And carbs are really quick sugars. So for our children that are quick on the go, they're getting quick bursts of energy with these carbs in order for them to continue to play. And when we think about a pint, say a pint of blueberries, a pint of blackberries, or even bananas, there's so much variability within our produce. So specifically blueberries, you could open up a pint and you could have one blueberry be mushy, you could have one be very sweet, you could have one be more firm and tangy. There's really no consistency, and you have to use all of those different senses to figure out what you're about to put in your mouth. And for our children, that's difficult. Another question I get is, my child prefers to graze. Is that a problem? Long story short, yes. Most of the time this is a problem because grazing actually interrupts our hunger satiety rhythm and can impact their digestion pretty significantly. So when we think about the ideal, and again, there's ideal and then there's real life, but when we think about ideal, children should be eating a meal or a snack every 2 to 3 hours with water only in between these meals. And our meal should last between 15 to 30 minutes, depending on our child's age. And snacks should be about 10 to 15 minutes. And when we think about these times, we want to stay underneath that 30-minute mark, because at 30 minutes, that's typically when our digestion can start to slow if we're continuing to consume foods. And one of the most popular questions I get is, my child just won't sit at the table. What do I do? That is a multifaceted question. There can be so many different reasons, and that's an area we would be happy to support you with. This could be due to lack of hunger cues. It could be due to unclear expectations. Maybe your child is overwhelmed with the sensory systems and the sensory properties of their food being provided. Or maybe they just need a little bit more movement to get their body ready for these sedentary tasks. And we'll go on to the next slide. So for our 2 to 4-year-old range, I want to just highlight some developmental expectations of what we would expect at this range. When we think about structure and our schedule, we would like our children to be able to sit at the table or the dining surface for 10 to 15 minutes without getting up and leaving. These meals or snacks should be occurring every 2 to 3 hours with water only in between. Our children should be demonstrating an interest in a new food when being presented, and this interest does not have to be consumption. It can be as something as poking a finger with it or smelling with it or looking at it. And our children should be able to participate in meals without any kind of rewards or pressure or coercion. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. In regard to diet variety, we want our children to have at least 10 different foods in each category of a fruit or a vegetable, and that is one category, grains, and then a protein. And in our country, we actually consider dairy as a protein source. So when we think about cheeses, yogurts, those are going to be considered proteins. What we don't consider a protein in this category is a glass of milk. We would like our children to be able to accept a wide variety of textures, from crunchy to foods with sauce, to mixed textures, to mushy foods. Now, it doesn't have to mean that they absolutely love them, but just accepting of them and not having meltdowns at the table over them. And we would like to see our children to be able to eat a wide variety of brands from foods and eat at different stores or eat at different restaurants. When we think about, the family holidays or different birthday parties, we want our children to be able to enjoy meals at all of those occasions. So we'll go to the next slide. And I want to highlight, picky eating is actually a typical phase. So in our children, typically around 12 to 18 months and even beyond then, our children are going through massive developmental changes, from their gross motor milestones to testing boundaries to understand what they can and cannot control. They're starting to build independence and understanding that they're their own person. Typically, feeding is one of the first areas that they target to seek control in. So yes, this is a typical phase. But what I want to do is I want to read off these questions, and I want you to think about, what is your answer to these questions. If you're answering yes, or you're thinking about your child in specific situations, you may be leaning towards that picky eating of not being a typical phase. And that's something that we can support you with because it is tricky. So I want you to think about, how does your child respond to new foods when they're being presented? Are they pushing the food away? Are they throwing it? Are there tantrums at mealtimes? Or are they saying, yuck, I don't like it? How does your child respond to different brands? Are they only accepting the Yoplait yogurt out of one container, or the cereal with a certain character on the front of it, or only chicken nuggets at a certain restaurant? And when we think about limited diet, does your child have a repertoire of less than 20 to 30 foods across all of those different categories we talked about? So that grain, the protein, and then the fruit or the vegetable. When we think about textures and colors, does your child avoid certain textures or certain colors, or do they prefer them? Now, I do want to highlight, at this age, something that is typical that we see is green being discriminated against first. So the spinach, the broccolis, the salads, that is usually a quote unquote yucky food for these children. It's typical. However, what's not typical is not being able to accept that food on their plate, in their area, not at least being able to smell it or being exposed to it. Do you find yourself bribing your child to try a new food or coercing them to stay at the table? And now this could be use of electronics to keep your child at the table. It could be the TV on, a tablet, music, however we introduce electronics to stay at the table. Do you feel yourself fighting with your child, leaving you frustrated at meal times? It doesn't have to be that way. Or do you find yourself preparing a separate meal for your child from the rest of the family? Is the rest of the family eating, steak and potatoes, and your child is over eating macaroni and cheese? We'll go to the next slide. So yes, picky eating is a phase, but I want you to think about your answers to those questions we just talked about, because if we don't address picky eating in these areas where we're starting to feel like, oh, it may be veering off the course of typical, there could be some potential consequences to it. So I want to think about, if we don't support picky eating, if we're starting to feel like it's veering off the course of typical, we could have reliance on that external motivation for rewards, distractions, any kind of pressure to eat. And then when we think about when these pressures or these rewards are taken away, our children actually don't know how to eat. Remember, learning it, this feeding is a learning behavior. So if we take away the sticker, if we take away the tablet, if we take away the dessert, our children actually don't know how to eat. When we think about this as well, you could have some limitations in social engagements. Eating in many cultures, especially ours, is very social. There's a lot of birthday parties, family gatherings that revolve around food. And so this could be one of those factors that we start to see limited participation in. With picky eating, it can also actually create physiological stress in our children. So when we think about physiological stress, if you're under stress like a flight, fight, or flee response, when we think about that, that actually turns off our hunger cues. So when our children are stressed, even if they don't appear stressed in the way that we would expect, their hunger cues are turned off. So in the moment of stressful meals, they're not going to have that hunger sense. So why would I be motivated, or why would I want to eat? Overall, we're going to think about a decrease in that child independence and that autonomy. We're not going to have that healthy relationship with food and meal times. And I'm sure you're logging on to this Zoom because you're experiencing stress. Feeding is hard. It's one of the only activities that happens multiple times a day that we feel like, as parents, it's our job to feed our kids, and it does not have to be as hard as maybe what you're experiencing. So we'll go on to the next slide. We can talk about feeding therapy. So this is specifically what myself, as a pediatric occupational therapist specializing in feeding, can support you with. And I want to think about how we can help your child. So with picky eating and with feeding therapy, we always take a play-based approach. It's one of the biggest recommendations in our research and in our clinical experience, because children actually learn through play. So when we think about play, it actually takes less repetitions or less exposure for a child to learn through play as it would otherwise. So otherwise, actually, we have some research saying it takes about 400 different repetitions to create these new connections. but done in play, it's about 10 to 20. So it's the biggest bang for your buck. It's going to be efficient. Can't say it's going to be quick, but we are going to make it enjoyable and efficient for your child. When we think about sensory normalization of the food properties, so we want to consider your child's sensory profile. So what kind of sensory experience are they experiencing when presented with a food? And is that causing a physiological response, such as stress, to their system? So is their stress system actually turning off their hunger cues? So we're going to start to create sensory normalization of the food properties. We're not going to say you're going to love every texture, but we're going to give them different ways to explore them, to kind of get their body ready to understand and anticipate what food is actually about to go into our mouth. So we're going to touch the foods, we're going to smell them, we're going to squish them, we're going to play with them, we're going to wipe them on our face to get them closest to our mouth. Again, those 32 steps of eating. And one of the biggest things is that we're going to establish and create these supportive coping strategies with new foods. Not every human, adult or child, is going to love every single food that is being presented to them. However, we can come up with some different strategies that we can explore these different foods. So if we are at a brand new restaurant and a unknown food gets put in front of us, we can at least look at it, we can smell it, we can move it around with our fork, start to figure out those properties. And if we're not interested, we all have these different coping strategies that we can go about. And we are just looking to establish these with our children as well. We'll go on to the next slide. And I want to focus on feeding therapy actually addresses and supports the family in such a significant way. When we think about the family, parent involvement is actually key and crucial to a picky eater's success, because feeding happens more often in the home with the family than it does with us in the settings that we are supporting you in. So when we think about this, we're going to create an individualized structure that works for you. So when you want to think about specifically your family, how can we support you? You know, there's those ideals of eating a meal every 2 to 3 hours, but what works for your family and how can we support you to meet that expectation as close as we can? When we think about picky eating and food exposure, exposure is the biggest thing that we can work on. So even if our children are not consuming the foods, exposing them to these different foods is going to be important. But again, we are going to support you in a way that understands your child's sensory preferences and their profile, so we can expose them without creating a stress response. And again, we want this to be personalized. We want every family to feel like we're meeting them where they're at, because not every family is the same. So we're going to create these different strategies so you can support them and you can create other strategies across all different environments that you're going to. And we'll go to the next slide. And you're logging on again, like I said, probably because you have a picky eater or you're interested in, is this typical for my child? So I want to leave you with some quick tips and tricks that we can think about just today. You can put these in your back pocket and you can run with them. One of the first ones would be establishing a mealtime routine. So mealtimes often are contextually influenced. So if we have a clear start and end to the meal, this can actually help our children understand what the expectation is for the next 15 to 30 minutes. Now, this can be something as easy as washing hands, bringing food to the table. It can be whatever your family feels is feasible to start and end a meal with. One of the biggest things that I do want to leave you with is this thing called division of responsibility. Ellen Satter is actually a psychologist who has studied for over 30 years in pediatric feeding, and she has come up with this division of responsibility. So parents are responsible for what, when, and where the child is being served. The child is responsible for whether they are going to eat and how much they are going to eat. Now that kind of seems like counterintuitive, probably to what is occurring in most homes, where we may be pressuring to eat more and eat more and eat 10 more bites. But when we start to shift our responsibility over to whether the child is going to eat and how much, that's when the child shifts their responsibility. Again, in that time frame of the 2 to 4, they're looking for control. They're going to shift their control into that what, when, and where. And when we start to see our children shift their responsibility to what, when, and where, that's when that picky eating vicious cycle can really fuel. Mealtime should be social as well. Remember, eating is a learned behavior and we learn through repetition and modeling. So, watching somebody else do it. So, whether we are exposed to something new, whether we are exposed to something familiar, having somebody sit beside us and consume similar or the same foods is going to be our best teacher. And now I really want to emphasize too, picky eating is hard. And yes, we do want our children to eat, but we also have to have them eat. So we can't present them with all these new foods and say, well, you're just going to learn because I'm modeling it for you. That's not the way it works without therapy. So I want to leave you with this 80 to 20 rule. 80% of the foods on your child's plate should be foods that they're familiar with and you know that they would enjoy without any concern. The other 20% should be a new food or a previously familiar food in a new presentation. So we want that 20% of an exposure on their plate or on a plate nearby them, because if we don't expose our kids to new foods, we really can't expect them to eat it. We'll go to the next slide. It's hard to talk about just about anything now without mentioning social media. So I want to leave you with some credible sources on social media. Specifically, these are websites, blogs, and then Instagram pages as well. When we think about Food Smart Kids, her name is Nina Johansson. She has actually created a feeding model that we will use. She's a speech language pathologist and then a lactation counselor as well. SOS stands for sequential oral sensory, or as Kay Toomey, the pediatric psychologist, says, save our ship. She works through sensory, normalization of food. So when we think about sequencing through that, that's another approach that we'll take through feeding and we can support you with. Feeding littles and then solid starts are typically geared towards the younger ages, but very, very helpful for our 2 to 4 ranges. So when we think about maybe younger siblings that are just starting the purees or the baby-led weaning approach, these two resources can be very beneficial for you as well. And we'll go to the next slide. And I know that that was a ton of information, so I'm very grateful that this is recorded and you can go back and rewatch. But if you find yourself having a light bulb moment or answering again yes to those questions, or feeling like your child, gosh, maybe this is starting to go off the course of typical, it is okay. And we are here and we want to support you. So I have Cindy McKibben's information here on the screen. Please reach out to her. And we would be more than happy to book a consultation with you to see how we can support you best. And that is